Well, welcome back to part 5 of our biblical foundations. Today we're going to talk about grace and sin. I think that sin probably almost requires some sort of biblical understanding. We've talked about love, we've talked about forgiveness, we've talked about justice, and all of those things are things that you can have a conversation without maybe bringing God into it. I think sin becomes a little bit more difficult. And I think a lot of times we have to measure sin, or we think about what is sin in terms of what violates God or what's contrary to God. I think a lot of times we think that we are sinners based on the things that we do. So when we're talking about sin and grace and how those two things impact each other or play off of each other, one of the things to consider is that we frequently view God's grace for us as something that came to deal with the sins that we've committed. I remember I came to faith when I was pretty young. Knew I wanted to be a preacher at 4 years old, and I did what was expected of me. I went to church. I obeyed my parents. I did what was expected of me because I thought that's what you do, right? If you're a good person, if you're a good Christian, you do what's expected of you. You show up for Awanas. Awanas was a big thing when I was growing up. I guess a lot of churches will still do that. You memorized your verse, and sometimes I was still memorizing it in the car on the way to church Wednesday night so that you could get the sticker or the badge or whatever it was that they gave you when you were 6 or 7 years old. And I grew up doing the right things and trying to. I remember it was super important to me in second and third grade, fourth grade in Sunday school to be the kid that had the answer. I really wanted to be that kid. I wanted to be the kid that our camp, and I think looking back on this was a really horrible idea. But our elementary camp that I went to in third, fourth, and fifth grade, every year in our church, they would nominate the best boy and the best girl of camp, and you'd get a medal. And man, I worked my butt off to be best boy every year at camp, and would brown nose the leaders and the sponsors and be sure I cleared their plates at lunch, or whatever I could do. And so when we look at those things, by the time I was 15 or 16 years old, I thought, I'm not really a sinner. That was kind of my view. I'm not really a sinner. Look how good I am. Look at all the things that I've done. I'm not partying like all my classmates were in high school. I'm not having sex with my significant other like my fellow classmates were. I'm not getting drunk on the weekends. I'm not, lying and sneaking out of the house. And so how I measured myself was I measured myself based on what I perceived to be sin or not sin. And so because I wasn't doing any of the bad things, the sinful things, my view of myself was that I was better than everybody else. That was my view of myself. And I wish that I could say that that's not the case, but it was genuinely the case. And I have a vivid picture in my head of sitting in Mr. Walker's 10th grade first period English class. And I was not the back seat in that row. There was one other kid behind me, but I was towards the back of the class. And I remember surveying the class and going, well, that person's having sex with their boyfriend, and that person partied all weekend, and this person doesn't go to church, and this person cusses really badly. And I sat there and I said, I'm better than every person in this room. That was legitimately how I thought and what I believed, because I was measuring myself based off of, I guess, a cultural view of sin or what was right or wrong, or maybe a cultural church's view of sin and what is right or wrong. And it was one of the few times that I really felt like God spoke to me. God has never spoken to me in an audible voice. I have a friend who has said that they've heard that. I haven't. But it was one of the times that it was really clear to me that God was communicating something to me. And I was 15, almost 16 years old, sitting in this class. And what I felt like God spoke to me is, you are an arrogant son of a gun. Who do you think you are? You're not better than anyone else. And in my mind, I'm justifying. And I'm like, well, of course I'm better than these other people. And I made the list again. Look at the things I'm not doing, and look at all the good things that I am doing. And I felt like God spoke to me again, and he said, you arrogant son of a gun, who do you think you are? You're no better than anyone else. And at this moment, it was a pivotal moment for me at 15 and a half years old. My view of sin and grace began to change. See, up to this point, my view had been, I didn't need very much of God's grace because I wasn't very sinful. I was grateful for God's grace, but I didn't need as much grace as these kids did in my classroom, because I was measuring myself not based off of not based off of what God says about who we are apart from him, but I was basing myself off of my conduct and my behavior and kind of how I had been taught to view it from a church perspective. But also, it's not really my teacher's fault. It really landed on me and my arrogance and my pride. And because I didn't view myself to be that much of a sinner, I didn't view myself to need that much of grace. And both of those were fundamental misunderstandings of sin and grace. See, you and I are not enemies of the cross of Christ. We are not by nature children of wrath, as Ephesians and Romans say. Reverse that, Romans and Ephesians say. We are not by nature these people. We are not by nature sinners and wicked and deprived of everything holy and right and good because we do bad things. We are by nature enemies of the cross of Christ because we do not acknowledge Jesus. It's an acknowledgement of Jesus that saves us and redeems us. And now the grace of every one of us, every human being who's ever lived on the planet is separated from God, is a sinner in need of grace, not because they've done a whole bunch of wicked things, but because they do not acknowledge Jesus the Son. And there was a point in my life I did not acknowledge Jesus as Lord. And that's what made me the enemy of God. It was a lack of faith. And what made me righteous wasn't all the good things that I was doing. It was my faith in Christ. And so when we think about sin and when we think about grace, we tend to look at people and go, oh, well, my marriage isn't as bad as theirs. And we have a list of standards that we're measuring them by, and we say, look at all these bad things that they're doing, or I wouldn't raise my kids the way they're raising their kids. Look at all these wicked things that they're doing, or I can't believe they had a beer with dinner, or I can't believe that they use this word or that word, or I can't believe that they've gone and seen these movies. And now we view sin based off of whether or not we've fulfilled some imaginary list of standards that we've come up with. And did, they need a lot of grace. Look at what a mess they are. And we forget that what separated us from God is lack of faith, what is disbelief. Like people who will die separated from God, people who will die and end up in hell tragically one day, will end up there not because they partied, not because they drank, not because they did drugs, not because of a sexual sin or anything. It will be because they have denied Jesus, the living God. And every one of us, 15-and-a-half-year-old arrogant Ryan, needed the fullness of the cross, not a piece of it, because I was fully the enemy of God, and now because of God's grace, I am fully a child of God. And the difference between those two things was not my behavior, but what I declared and what I knew about Jesus Christ. And so talk about that. What is the biblical foundation of grace? What is the biblical foundation of sin? What does it mean for us to be separated from God? And what then does it mean for us to have his grace poured out on us and lavished on us? Not because of what we've done or not done, but because of who he is and what we declare by faith about Jesus Christ. And so there's a lot more to be said about that. We don't have time. And so talk about it amongst yourselves, and let's ask God to give us a biblical view of sin and grace. And we will talk again next week. Have a good week.